I'm in a European city at the moment. I feel so much tension, so much stress here. And I'm feeling the horror of a world that is less and less and less still, more agitated, more electrified, more buzzed, more wired. I'm feeling the need to find stillness, the need to speak from stillness. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, done nobis pacem. Grant us peace, grant us stillness, grant us the stillness where we can be really recollected.
Yes, that strange, shaggy figure you see lurking in the shadows is me, Roger Buck, as I was years ago in January 2008 in Switzerland, and this is obviously me years later, January 2022, and if you stick around, we're going to be watching some more of that old Roger that I've unearthed in some old video. But before we come to that, I want to set the scene for this old video, because there's a lot of differences between that Roger and the Roger I am today, and the principal difference that I want to highlight is that that Roger is in a transition between different universes. Now, as I've explained before on this channel, I come from a very different universe to Catholicism. I come from an esoteric background. First, I was involved in the Eastern esotericism of Theosophy. Theosophists like Helena Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, who are so much at the root of today's New Age movement. I was also at the New Age community of Findhorn. Later on, I got involved with the Christian esotericism of Rudolf Steiner and Anthroposophy. And a profound Catholic thinker called Valentin Tomberg led me slowly out of those worlds. But it was a slow process. And the Roger who you're about to see, if you're foolish enough to keep watching, is a Roger who hasn't yet fully arrived at the Catholic mystery. To be precise, he's followed Valentin Tomberg into the Catholic Church. He's had the sacrament of confirmation. He is a confirmed Catholic, but his mind is still resisting. In my heart, I'm feeling the power of the Catholic sacraments working on me. I am going to Mass, I am a practicing Catholic, but my mind is still resisting the Church. This is, I think, a very common problem of people who come from the kind of esoteric background that I come from. And it doesn't matter, in this case, whether it's the Eastern esoteric streams of the Theosophists, the places like Findhorn or New Age, or the Christian anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner. Obviously, Rudolf Steiner, being a Christian, is very different from Blavatsky. And he deserves credit, I think, inasmuch as he defended Christ in his system of anthroposophy and resisted the Theosophists, as we'll hear about later on. But these two streams of esotericism have one thing in common, at least. They both tend to look down on the Catholic Church. Often with, many of these people, and I was certainly one of them, anyway, maybe I should just speak for myself, with a sense of arrogance. Like there is a surety that the Catholic Church belongs to something from the past. It's outdated now. It's outmoded. It's irrelevant. As I've said before on this channel, it took me a lot of time to discard those ideas. The Catholic mystery kept working on my heart. Valentin Tomberg was helping unshackle my mind, but the Roger you're about to see here hasn't yet made it. He's not completely there yet. In fact, I know that the very next morning, after this video was filmed, that I was off for a several-day visit to the Gratuitous in Switzerland, which is the world center of anthroposophy that we've mentioned in a previous video, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to again. So, that Roger is still caught between very different universes. But there are other ways that make that Roger different. For one thing, he's not living in Switzerland. He's actually living in France. He's just crossed over to Zurich that day to spend one night and one night only in Zurich in Switzerland. That's important for reasons we'll come to. But I want to say a little bit about his life in France. I lived very simply then, a very alternative lifestyle, actually a poverty-stricken lifestyle. Kim and I, my wife, and I lived on a small holding in France. At least that's where we were based. This is the kind of place there was no running water. You had to go and get water in the car, or a van we had, big containers. Actually, before that, I was in a sort of small holding in Spain where you had to climb the mountain and get the water in a wheelbarrow. So very cut off from, the modern things that we're accustomed to in the so-called first world anyway. Also very cut off from the internet. I did not have internet in those days. No way to have internet. I think the smartphone or iPhone had only just been invented. I didn't have one of those. I still don't have one of those. So that's that. In that way, I'm still the same, friends. I do find many aspects of the modern world, things like smartphones, almost unbearable. So I'm still the same there. But anyway, this Roger is living in these small holdings in Spain first, but then France, very cut off from the modern world. And he's come into Zurich for one night only. And the person that I'm staying with in Zurich tells me about YouTube. I've never heard of YouTube in my life before. It was 2008. I don't suppose I'd ever heard of Facebook at that time. I can't remember, but anyway, never heard of YouTube. And this person is putting up videos on YouTube and gives me the opportunity to say, well, would you like to film something up and put it up on YouTube? This is all like science fiction for me back in 2008. But we filmed some films that night in Zurich. And that's what we're going to be looking at. Old films of me. There's actually an old film of my wife, Kim, as well, which we may put on if she lets me do it. But really, the point I want to make here is that this modern world that we all take for granted, of social media, of Facebook, of YouTube, of smartphones, of all these kinds of things, was virtually unknown to this Roger. I hope that helps explain some of the old videos that I'm about to put up here. I want to say, though, that I'm actually slightly embarrassed to put these up, although I do think there's a value to it, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it, obviously. But I'm slightly embarrassed because I think some of my regular viewers may find these quite strange. Some of the vocabulary I'm using is strange, coming out of this esoteric world that I've been in, but more to the point, I think my whole manner is very different from how I express myself now. I'm even worried, some people might be looking at this and thinking, is Roger stoned here or something? The answer to that is no. I've never really been into getting stoned on dope. So, if I'm not stoned here, why do I seem so strange? And part of the reason here, friends, is I've emerged out of a world of silence. Now that's partly because, as I said, I was living on this homestead in France, and I've just arrived in the big city, in Zurich, and it's really quite jarring, all of this kind of electricity all around me. But it's actually more than just that. Because en route from the farm, and this is, by the way, this is January the 4th. So this is over Christmastide. And I've basically been on a spiritual retreat in Paray-le-Monial in France. I've been spending day after day after day after day going to Mass and in silent prayer in this incredible location. As I've said in other videos, Paray-le-Monial is the place that changed my life. Episode 4, if you're interested, I go into this. And even more deeply, I think, in the massive, almost 5-hour episode I did on my journey with Tomberg over 25 years, also on Tomberg's thinking, also on France, Steiner, Anthroposophy, and a whole lot more. But yes, I really do go into, in that episode, what happened to me in Paray-le-Monial. Paray-le-Monial is the site where the Sacred Heart of Jesus was revealed to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque in 1673. Now, this is the kind of thing that I would never have come across, at Findhorn, or even in, Anthroposophy. The Anthroposophists, I'm sure, would be very suspicious of this. They would see it as part of Jesuit spirituality. And as we spoke about in an earlier episode, the Anthroposophists are very deeply suspicious of the Jesuits. Because Rudolf Steiner himself was suspicious of the Jesuits, and indeed issued rather a lot of, in my view, unfortunate polemic contra the Jesuits, and we're coming back to that. But I had arrived in France, and I found this town, Paray-le-Monial, where the Sacred Heart of Christ was revealed. Later on, I actually found that Tomberg spoke about what happened in this town as an intervention from heaven to save the soul of humanity. And that's what we're slowly coming to in this episode. Heaven intervening to save the soul of humanity. And we'll be contrasting that with Rudolf Steiner's hopes, actually very sincere hopes to save the soul of humanity, because Steiner was genuinely and sincerely concerned with the fate of humanity. But he didn't trust the church with that, and he certainly didn't trust Jesuit devotions like that of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. But again, we're coming to that. My point now is that just being in Paray, feeling, dwelling in the Catholic mystery, dwelling, I feel actually still close to the Sacred Heart. I remember, I've said this I think on another video, but ages later, I met an old lady in France, and I told her how deeply I loved Paray-le-Monial, and she said, yes, the heart of Christ is still beating there. It's just an incredible, incredible place. So I say to anyone, if they have a chance to go there, well, it's incredible. But my point now, friends, is that the Roger who's just emerged into Zurich is finding myself rattled by the electricity and the buzz, is still feeling the effects of day after day after day after day of the Mass, of the Catholic mystery. Yes, maybe the heart of Christ. And that's why I may seem, a little strange. I think I also want to just say right now here in Ireland, as I say, it's January. That was just before Epiphany. This is just after Epiphany. I think I just want to say, friends, just a brief aside. Every Christmastide, I try to switch off all the electricity and the computers as much as humanly possible, and still go into silence. This is again something actually that Tomberg pointed to, that Christmastide is an incredible time. And so I'm also just now still in the wake of really quite a heavenly Christmastide. So that's another factor. It's not just Paray-le-Monial, it's the fact that I had the grace of being at Paray-le-Monial over Christmastide. And it was an incredible, incredible gift to me. But without further ado, I think I'm going to start showing you the videos, and then there'll be commentary on them as well.
There's no script here. Maybe half an hour ago, someone gave me the opportunity to make a short film and put it on the internet. A technology that's never available to me usually. And I just seized the chance. I don't even know what I'm going to speak about. Horror. I spend a lot of time in these last holy nights of Christmas being with the horror of this world. And it seems to me that that's a very healthy thing. It actually feels to me like it's a grace of God that's been given to me. For years, I've had this inner battle in myself. I've had this mounting sense of horror, and I've asked myself, am I just being dramatic? How can any human being evaluate what the world is really like? All the incredible beauty in this world. All the incredible horror. If we hold only the beauty and forget the horror, we lose compassion. If we hold only the horror and forget the greatness of God, the greatness of beauty, we become morose, depressed. It's necessary to hold both. It seems to me that with the grace of God, I'm being allowed to hold more of the horror. I'm in a European city at the moment. I feel so much tension, so much stress here. I feel a way of life that I want to say that it's very American, that Europe becomes ever more Americanized. But I don't really think the problem is America. I think evil is working in all kinds of very subtle ways that we don't speak usually about. We speak about the evil of Hitler or Mao or Stalin, but we don't speak so much about evil working through mediocrity. We don't speak about evil working to confine people in tiny little confined existences where they become slaves to a mediocre and shallow life. We don't speak so much about evil working through all kinds of world currents which hypnotize us, that rob us of the capacity to be really still. I feel the need to just create stillness. Stillness where we can be, where I can be, very recollected, the heart of Christ. One thing, a healthy sense of horror brings one to, if one is a Christian, is a sense of deepening and deepening and deepening gratitude, awe, reverence for our Lord. At least I am grateful that this force, that sounds so impersonal, to be impersonal is not to be Christian, that in the center of our world exists a beating heart, a heart ready to vitalize us. These words are not born from as deep a stillness as they could be born from. I feel the horror. I feel the grace of horror. So much New Age thought is about feel good. And indeed, it's very important to feel good when we are faced with beauty. But right now, we're in this world, you and me, surrounded by countless forms of horror and suffering. More and more, I feel asked to keep holding that. Not to become depressed, not to become morose, but not to forget it, and to somehow feel it. It's one thing to say in an intellectual way, well, there are millions of children dying right now. But if my own child or your own child were dying in your own arms, that would be an entirely different thing. I find it useful to contemplate the difference between those two forms of cognition and awareness, where the head can say, well, of course, there's all kinds of suffering in this world. And then a form of contemplation where it's no longer a head process. And it feels as though through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, I'm being given the grace of feeling the horror more and more deeply. In these holy nights, this is January the 4th, 2008, I've had the privilege of spending many of these holy nights since Christmas in Paray-le-Monial in France, the city of the Sacred Heart of Christ, and feeling that presence more and more deeply. I've had the grace of a great deal of stillness in these last holy nights, and I'm feeling the horror of a world that is less and less and less still, more agitated, more electrified, more buzzed, more wired. I'm feeling the need to find stillness, the need to speak from stillness. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, done nobis pacem. Grant us peace, grant us stillness, grant us the stillness where we can begin to be really recollected, more and more aware of who we are, what we are doing. My words are so feeble. Who I am, what I am doing, is an incredible mystery to myself, as you are to yourself, and what you are doing. And when I think of the words on the other video, they seem so feeble. I speak about being given the grace to feel a little more of the horror of this world, but I do know that it's only a very little more. But more and more deeply, I trust in you, Lord, that you are holding all the horror. You are holding every dying child in your arms. You are freezing with every freezing person. You are with every heartbreak. You are holding the horror, and you are dedicating your life to meeting, to embracing, to holding this horror. We have, if we are lucky, only a tiny amount of capacity for this. But we give thanks if you make our hearts a little bit more like unto your heart, your wide, open, infinite, sacred heart, holding the horror of every man, every woman, every child, I think every animal. We're in a world where animals are devouring each other, insects are devouring each other, fear is being generated all the time. We're in a world of the fall. Yes, we're in a world of incredible cooperation and love, countless acts of mercy and kindness and beauty. You are holding this horror, Lord. Help us to hold the horror with you. Krishnamurti impressed me very deeply once when he said that any true feeling, any feeling that could be worth being called a feeling, would always have a corresponding action. What I take he meant by that is that there's a great deal of emotional masturbation. There's a great deal of ranting. There's a great deal of moroseness. There's a great deal of emotions that don't lead to action. And then there is real feeling. Feeling. One hopes, beginning to feel, just beginning to feel, the horror of the world. And a real feeling like that, it seems to me, will lead to some kind of concrete action. Action to change oneself. Action, if one is a Catholic, as I am, to go to the Eucharist, to go to Mass, and bring myself to Christ. More and more, I'm given the grace of this notion of trying to bring myself to Christ. I feel so feeble, I feel so weak. I am aware of such capacity for hypocrisy here. I speak about real feeling leading to action, and yet how little action do I really take? I find myself judging all kinds of people, judging the shallowness of this world, looking at people whose life activity seems to revolve around creating appearances, making their CV look better, not engaging with the horror that is all around us. And I forget how little I'm engaged with the horror. I forget, Lord, how much you realize that every human heart is very, very, very feeble in its capacity to engage what's really going on.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. I said I wanted to offer some commentary. I'm trying to pull all that together. It's not going to be all that easy. I'm conscious of so much that may seem strange or difficult for at least certain of my viewers, not necessarily all of my viewers, but you go back to that material 15 years ago. I'm speaking about Krishnamurti. I was once very deeply immersed in Krishnamurti, or I'm about to go on a pilgrimage to the Goetheanum, the world center of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy. Steiner was very much on my mind as well at that point. I see Steiner's influence in that video, certainly though, above all, Valentin Tomberg's influence. And we're coming to that. To kick off, to try to explain what I'm saying there about silence, about this video being born from silence. I'd like to read you just a few words from Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. Again, I must not tire of repeating, this book has nothing to do with telling fortunes with tarot cards. Very difficult to describe what this book is. I sometimes speak about it as 100 books rolled into one. But it's certainly a book about mysticism, about Christian mysticism, and about the power of silence. And Tomberg, in this connection, speaks about concentration without effort, which is a paradox, because we normally associate that real concentration takes intense effort. But Tomberg speaks about concentration without effort, or in the French, concentration sans effort. So, here's Tomberg. Concentration without effort. That is to say, where there is nothing to suppress, and where contemplation becomes as natural as breathing. And the beating of the heart is the state of consciousness, i.e., thought, imagination, feeling, and will, of perfect calm, accompanied by the complete relaxation of the nerves and the muscles of the body. It is the profound silence of desires, of preoccupations, of the imagination, of the memory, and of discursive thought. One may say that the entire being becomes like the surface of calm water, reflecting the immense presence of the starry sky and its indescribable harmony. And the waters are deep. They are so deep. And the silence grows, ever increasing. What silence? Its growth takes place through regular waves, which pass one after the other through your being, one wave of silence, followed by another wave of more profound silence, then again a wave of still more profound silence. Have you ever drunk silence? If in the affirmative, you know what concentration without effort is. And what I want to say about that is that some of us will recognize what Tomberg is speaking about in those words, some of us won't. But I do recognize what he's speaking about. I have drunk silence, and many of you will have as well. And what I have found in terms of drinking silence, it's not something that, I manage every day or anything like that. But I find that certain localities in time, like Christmastide, are ideal for concentration without effort or drinking silence. Or certain localities in space, like the sacred Catholic sites where the apparitions of the Sacred Heart or Our Lady happened, like Lourdes in France, the Rue de Bac, Knock in Ireland. These are places where I could enter ever more deeply into silence, or indeed monasteries. In fact, when my wife and I rediscovered that footage, she said, "You look like a monk." And, my first thought was, oh, well, she means like an Orthodox monk. And no, she said, in a deeper way. And I can see what she's getting at, because I'm married, but Kim and I really live, to a large extent like hermits. We have for many years. By the way, Kim has given me permission to include her in this video, so we'll be coming to Kim later on in the video as well. But really what I'm trying to say is that this contrast between drinking silence and the buzz and electricity of the modern world is something that was really haunting me then, and it's haunting me even more today. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it, why it's haunting my soul even more today? Because so much has changed, incredibly changed, in these last 15 years. When that video was recorded, Facebook, YouTube, these things were in their infancy. The iPhone had just been invented in 2007. And all of this, as I was saying, was like science fiction to me. I recall just a few years after this, because, these things did arrive in America, generally speaking, much earlier than they arrived in Europe. And in Europe, a few years later, I met a woman with an iPhone or a smartphone or something like that, and it's like she seemed symbiotically connected to this thing. I couldn't get over how much she was intertwined with this piece of machinery. I mean, she was actually a very moving person to me. I worried a little bit about her, seeing how symbiotically connected she seemed to this device, and yet now, of course, they are everywhere. And I am disturbed about these things, and maybe this also helps me explain a little bit When I do speak, about my concerns about what I sometimes call, although it's not exactly accurate, I grant you, the Americanization of Europe, because America does have a certain kind of technological brilliance, and it brings us the gifts. It brings us here in Europe the gifts of that. I'm recording you this now in iMovie on an Apple Mac, major American company. But part of my whole life story is that I am, as I've said in other episodes, an American in that I was born in America, and I've spent now most of my life in Europe. And I know that Americans come over to Europe, and they see they see Europe rather as sometimes rather backward or quaint. That Europe still hasn't caught up with a sort of fast, buzzy, electronic kind of vibe that is coming out of America. These are things that I cannot help but meditate on, ponder on, given who I am, given my biography as an American in Europe who has watched over 40 years of my life Europe be transformed by all kinds of currents coming out of America. I know that I'm very dangerously close to being unjust towards America, and I don't want to do that. Yes, I believe that America has this technological brilliance. The American people have it. Not all peoples have it. This is something Rudolf Steiner very much believed. I believe it too, which is partly why this digression is not irrelevant to the themes of this episode. I don't think the Irish, as they've been down through the centuries, have that technological brilliance, to be honest. I don't suppose the Poles do, or the Croatians do. America has this huge vitality, youthful vitality. It's also, with 330 million Americans, it's like the big kid on the block. But it's not America's fault that it is so large. It's just something I think Americans need to be aware of. The old idea that, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold, that isn't true of, smaller places like Ireland or Croatia or even Poland. But right now, I want to move on to Tomberg, because those of you who know Tomberg well will certainly recognize that what I recorded in that video all those years ago after coming out of Paray-le-Monial is certainly indebted to Tomberg. I mean, what would have been happening in that time in Paray is I would have been spending, I'm sure, 3, 4, 5 hours of silence in those incredible chapels in Paray-le-Monial in the morning, and probably, later on in the afternoon and in the evening during my retreat, I was reading and rereading Tomberg, Steiner. Steiner's legacy is obvious to me in those words as well. But I think as we develop this episode, where we'll be talking a lot more about Tomberg, also Steiner as well, it would help now if I could just beg your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen. I want to run about 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes maybe, from an earlier episode we did on this channel about Tomberg, about the dehumanization of the world. For those of you who haven't seen it, I think this will really help us develop the themes of this episode. Yeah, it might be helpful if I bring the thumbnail up of this video, because the thumbnail is really showing what that episode was about, which was comparing Tomberg's deeply, deeply human approach with our dehumanized society today. Just that is captured in the thumbnail, I hope, but I'd like to just run you 4 minutes from that episode, and then we'll say more. We have a contrast between what I see as a very warm, loving, extremely human man on the left, Valentin Tomberg. And maybe the most moving thing that I find about Tomberg is that he is the most human figure, it seems to me, that I have ever encountered in literature, in modern literature anyway. And we have that juxtaposed with the disturbing image of a tremendously dehumanized man, which many of you will recognize, I think, as Captain Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek, in an episode where Picard was subjected to the Borg, was Borgified. You know, I've spoken before about the Borgification of the world, by which I mean, you know, the danger of our society becoming ever more mechanical, ever more robotic, ever more technocratic and dehumanized. And really, I owe many of those thoughts to Tomberg's thinking as he expressed it, you know, over the whole of his life. This includes also his pre-Catholic writings. Now, I'm not endorsing those pre-Catholic writings, his anthroposophical writings, as I want to make very clear now, and in the other big episodes about Tomberg, deeply regretted and renounced writing those anthroposophical books. But nonetheless, we can say that this concern with dehumanization informs all his writing and thinking. I mean, in his final Catholic writings, in Lazarus Come Forth, Tomberg warns of what he calls the Centaur. The Centaur being a beast that has a human head and a horse's body, and he uses this to invoke the idea or the danger of humanity losing feeling and becoming only thinking and willing. So the trinity of thinking, feeling, and willing is replaced by a binary where human beings can think in at least a technocratic way and have an animalistic, will, but with no heart, no feeling. This is what he speaks about as the danger of the centaur, and this metaphor of the centaur is very close to the metaphor of the Borg. Again, a condition where a voracious, devouring will is combined with mighty intelligence, albeit of a technological kind, but where no wisdom, no heart, and no humanity is present anymore. And he speaks about the danger to humanity in countless other ways. Whether it's the sickness of the West, is that it's losing its creative elan that he speaks about in Meditations on the Tarot, whether it's the degeneration that he speaks about in the jurisprudence writings. I mean, there he speaks about how the soul of the Occident, which depends on what he calls the great temple of piety, is losing its life force. Whether he's speaking about the West becoming arid and dry, what we see in Tomberg is, I would suggest, a very, very human man, encouraging us to humanization, to personalization through our Lord Jesus Christ, who represents, of course, the truest form of humanity there could possibly be. Humanization through Christ. This is what Tomberg is speaking about his entire life long. All right. Even though what you've just seen was only recorded in the last year or so, all those things were actually present in my soul 15 years ago in some form or another, because I was immersed in Tomberg when I was at Paray-le-Monial. And I just want to bring something up, because I've been speaking about humanization and how deeply human Tomberg is. We're going to do a whole episode about this soon, hopefully, but I have been just incredibly moved recently by finally reading G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. This is the Angelico Press edition. Everlasting Man being, of course, our Lord Jesus Christ. But one feels the deep, deep, deep human qualities of the loveliness of G.K. Chesterton, and startlingly, to my mind, there are real parallels between The Everlasting Man, Chesterton's sort of Christological masterpiece, It is. It's a masterpiece. And Tomberg's Christological thinking in Meditations on the Tarot. But that's a footnote for a future episode on Chesterton. My point now is that really back then it was Tomberg that I was, as a Catholic, that I was more or less exclusively immersed in, although I was still very much reading Steiner then. And indeed, what we've just heard does have a certain debt, definitely, to Steiner. As I've been saying in these episodes, there are certainly continuities between Steiner's thinking and Tomberg's thinking, and I repeat, there are also the most radical and stark discontinuities. But one of the continuities certainly is that Steiner was also seeing the same degeneration, the same dehumanization going on. Steiner was concerned in his own way with the binary that we just, invoked there by playing that from the past. This binary whereby, humanity becomes, or is in danger of becoming, like a thinking animal. Steiner is very concerned about that as well. Steiner invoked a great demonic presence that he called Ahriman. And according to Steiner, this great demon Ahriman and legions of Ahrimanic demons were leading humanity into, greater and greater technocracy. And as we mean to explore in this episode on Steiner and Tomberg, Tomberg comes very radically to reject Steiner's idea of Ahriman. Tomberg does not hold with this at all, and indeed sees this as a dangerous conception. But nonetheless, what Tomberg is saying about the Centaur, this binary of a thinking animal, without heart, without human qualities, even though Tomberg is rejecting the notion of Steiner's Ahriman, I would say that this aspect of Tomberg's thinking certainly has a certain continuity with Steiner. And I want to do something now, ladies and gentlemen. I want to read you a passage about the Centaur, because in some way it relates, and actually astonishingly so, as you'll hear if you stick around, to my experience in Paray-le-Monial. So look, it's always a bit tricky pulling these passages out of Tomberg, like I did earlier with the passage on concentration without effort, because Tomberg is deepening and deepening and deepening these things through his writings, and pulling a few lines out of context is always going to suffer. It's going to be a bit odd in certain ways, but I am going to now pull some lines from Tomberg about the Centaur, about the danger of the Centaur, because it's utterly relevant to what happened to me in Paray-le-Monial. It's relevant to this episode, and if you stick around, you'll see maybe it's relevant to everything I'm trying to do on this channel as a whole. Because although it won't be immediately obvious when I read this passage to you, Tomberg is actually speaking in this passage about Paray-le-Monial. And it's so not obvious that it wasn't obvious to me when I first went to Paray-le-Monial. Let me just be clear before we dive into this passage about the Sacred Heart of Jesus, about the danger of the Centaur, the binary of thinking and animal will, Tomberg does not speak directly about Paray-le-Monial, but as we mean to draw out, what he says has everything to do with Paray-le-Monial. Maybe, finally, before we dive into this, this, by the way, is from Tomberg's final writings, Covenant of the Heart, although it's now titled Lazarus Come Forth. Before we come to that, let me just say that when I first went to Paray-le-Monial, I knew very little about Paray-le-Monial. I knew nothing about, the cult of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and how it had hugely transformed Catholicism. Actually, not all that many Catholics do know about Paray-le-Monial. Everyone's heard of Lourdes, and you go to Lourdes in France, and it's a sort of massive tourist site. Paray-le-Monial is still a very quiet place compared to Lourdes. It's this place that transformed my life, but people don't really know about it. But oh my, I'm maybe getting ahead of myself. What I want to do now is read you slowly and meditatively, hopefully, some lines, yes, ripped out of a greater context, where Tomberg is speaking about things that relate to everything I'm trying to address in this episode. There have been, and still are, times in Europe and elsewhere during which, for whole nations, the life of the soul as such has been, and still is, in grave danger. So, I'm just going to draw things out here. They may be obvious, but Tomberg never stops, warning about the danger to the human soul, the danger of materialism. It's not always in his writings in the most obvious way, but for those who really immerse themselves in Tomberg's writing, they're aware of this thread of commentary, of degeneration. So radically different from, New Age ideas of progress or, the threat of degeneration. Yeah, maybe it's worth mentioning yet again that Tomberg's key jurisprudence book is called The Degeneration and Regeneration of Jurisprudence. Key theme in Tomberg. So, in speaking about the life of the soul being smothered, he says, this holds not only with respect to the tidal wave of materialism that has flooded across the world in this century, but also for the outpouring of intellectual enlightenment during the age of rationalism in the 18th century, which paved the way for materialism. So, we're talking about the Enlightenment in the 1700s, 18th century, that has led to today's excessive materialism. You could go back even before that, 1700s, 1600s, the revelation of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, ladies and gentlemen, in Paray-le-Monial happens in 1673 in France, just before, the Enlightenment really hits France. So take that in. That's important for understanding this passage. 1673, St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, Christian Catholic mystic, beholds the Sacred Heart of Jesus in Paray-le-Monial in France, and out of that revelation of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the cult of the Sacred Heart of Jesus is born, and it spreads across the entire Catholic world. Of course, not the Protestant world, but it spreads across the entire Catholic world as a result of these mystical revelations of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So, Tomberg goes on to say, at that time, the danger facing the human soul was so great, so the time of rationalism emerging, that in order to avert it, a special intervention from heaven proved necessary as a preventative measure. This took place during the second half of the 17th century, it was then that the revelation of the most sacred heart of Jesus occurred. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is what was so striking for me. When I first went to Paray, I didn't realize that Tomberg was speaking about Paray-le-Monial here, because, I was really only entering into the Catholic mystery. He doesn't actually mention Paray-le-Monial in this paragraph that I'm reading you, but it's clear from the context, where he says this happened in the second half of the 17th century, i.e. the late 1600s, that he can mean nothing other than what happened in Paray, starting in 1673. Nothing else in Catholicism at that time unfolded. What happened here, the cult of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And then he goes on to name it, but it's all coming out of Paray, even though he doesn't use the word Paray. And I didn't know that. at the time. This led to the cult of devotion to the most sacred heart of Jesus, which spread rapidly in Catholic cultures and took root there, i.e. it took tremendous root in Ireland. Everywhere in Ireland, houses, homes, had, images of the Sacred Heart with a lamp, burning to the Sacred Heart. An old Irish lady I met once said that when she was getting a new home built in the 70s, I think, the builders said, "Where do you want your fixture for the lamp for your Sacred Heart?" It was just a deep part of Irish Catholic culture before, as I see it, Ireland became Anglo-Americanized or globalized in recent decades. But as late as the 1970s, the builders were saying, where do you want your lamp, to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, because they consulted every house that they were building. So that's an Irish expression of the cult of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. There's countless other ones, but it all goes back to what Tomberg is saying here. So, again, Tomberg saying this led to the cult of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which spread rapidly in Catholic cultures and took root there. And then he says this very striking sentence for those of you who are taking Tomberg seriously like I do. Devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus was to save the soul of humanity. I'm going to come back to that, because what Tomberg is saying, this intervention from heaven, we're in the most radical discontinuity from Rudolf Steiner now. We're coming back to that. But I will repeat it. Devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus was to save the soul of humanity. For with the intellectual enlightenment, the danger threatening to break in upon human beings was that of the Centaur. Human beings would have been turned into a kind of centaur, a being consisting of head and limbs, intellect and will, but without heart. That is, a clever beast. Devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus had the task of rekindling the heart. Thereby the light, warmth, and life streaming from the heart of Jesus was to counteract the will to power and the intellect serving this will. I'm going to read a bit more in a minute, but I'm going to say something just spontaneous here about Ireland. When I came to Ireland first 20 years ago, felt it was the most human society of all the countries I've ever come across. I actually still feel that today. Didn't know I was going to say that, but it's part of everything that informs what I'm going on this channel, that we are in danger of the Centaur. We are in danger of a binary of technocracy and animalistic will. Because Tomberg actually goes on to say, be that as it may, even though this has happened, The soul, understood as the most refined and deepest life of the heart, is by no means certain of survival, not even within Christian civilized mankind. All kinds of danger threaten, and destruction is an ever-present danger. The life of the soul has to be cultivated and stimulated, as took place and is still taking place, with the help of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. What deeply moving moral depth and beauty can be seen and experienced through devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. What great moral depth can be seen and experienced through this devotion. Oh my. Before we continue, I want to make a personal confession. This episode is a little bit sprawling and out of control. It's going in all kinds of directions that I did not anticipate. But maybe it's because, ladies and gentlemen, these issues are so key to what my whole life and work is about. I'm going to hold up my book here, Cor Jesu Sacratissimum, which, if you don't know, is Latin for Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, and has the Sacre-Cœur de Montmartre in Paris on the cover, which was another expression of the cult of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the great Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Paris. My whole life is sort of turning around these things since my life transformed, really, in Paray-le-Monial all those years ago. Something in those chapels at Paray-le-Monial, I can't say that I had, a vision of the heart of Christ or the beating heart of Christ. As this old lady said, you can feel the heart of Christ still there. But the chapels were conducive to incredible prayer and silence. Something in Paray-le-Monial is there, and it did help me to break free from my accumulated secular, anthroposophical, New Age kind of thinking. And I'm not really sure that I could have completely done it without that very special presence in Paray-le-Monial. I mean, yes, I was poring over Tomberg, reading and rereading Meditations on the Tower. Tomberg was deconstructing my old thinking as well. I want to say that just as I'm reflecting on all of this, just as I've been reading you this, let's see if I can find this. I'm hit again by a single line, I think. The life of the soul has to be cultivated and stimulated, as took place and is still taking place, with the help of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I'm not going to go into it now, but a friend sent me a very chilling article about modern warfare and how it dehumanizes people by turning them into killing machines. We're not going into that right now. Maybe another episode, but it's sort of aching in my heart. And I am with this line. The life of the heart needs to be cultivated and stimulated. And what is so significant in this passage is how much Tomberg is suggesting this happens through devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Now, it's not the only way. What we read earlier, Tomberg saying, have you ever drunk silence? Tomberg is very much suggesting that silence, Christian prayer, silence, is critical for saving the soul of humanity. So yes, Tomberg is working with many things and many approaches. Obviously, the Mass, the sacraments of the Church, including confession, But really, I've been speaking before in these episodes about something that I call Tomberg's project. If you like, Tomberg's project to rekindle the soul, rekindle the heart, the life of humanity. And it's a project, as I've said before, with many aspects. Certainly sacramental, devotional, ecclesiastical, but also philosophical, esoteric, hermetic, the contemplation, for example, of symbols, like the symbols of the tarot. It's a project that's psychological and in the sense of psychotherapy. I believe we'll be coming later in this episode to Tomberg working with the legacy, to baptize it, so to speak, of C.G. Jung, and political. Tomberg, as we've been speaking about in these episodes, does not go with the modern politics of the Enlightenment that found expression in 1789 and even in 1776. There's, as I've been studying Tomberg's work over these last 25 years, I see this sincere attempt to respond to this terrible sense of crisis of materialism and how materialism and Enlightenment rationalism is destroying us. He doesn't usually use, the grim metaphors that I use, like the Borgification of the world. The Centaur, that passage about the Centaur is the closest he comes to that. But he's constantly speaking about the dangers of materialism. He speaks very much about the danger of us all becoming mechanical, in want of life, dry, arid. The West is losing its life force. It's losing its piety. You read these works carefully and you will see them as a response to this loss of life force in the West, to this crisis of us all becoming more and more mechanical. In a sense, Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy was a grand project to rescue humanity from degeneration, but a project separated from the church. Tomberg's work, above all his magnum opus, which I describe as 100 books rolled into one, working on all these different fronts at once, not just also psychotherapeutic, but also very much, working with science and challenging some of the assumptions of the scientific revolution. There's 100 books rolled into one in Meditations on the Tarot, and it's this vast attempt to counter the growing forces of materialism. I want to say something now about how all of this relates to Rudolf Steiner, because this passage is actually a key illustration of what I'm saying in these Tomberg these Tomberg episodes. I'm saying that we do find real continuities with Steiner and Anthroposophy, with the most incredible discontinuities. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it's been many years since I studied Steiner in depth, and I can't really bring out quotes to prove this right now especially, but nonetheless, I did once study Steiner in great, great, great depth indeed, and I can guarantee you that Rudolf Steiner would see devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus as a backwards step. Devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus became a Jesuit devotion, because although St. Margaret Mary Alacoque was certainly not a Jesuit, she was a visitation nun, her confessor, St. Claude La Colombière, was a Jesuit, and he was the one who spread devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus across the Catholic world. It became something incredibly associated with the Jesuits, and as we've explored in earlier episodes, Steiner really sees Jesuitism in the most terrible light. Just if you're coming on board recently, let me just back up and make this clear. Steiner is a Christian. Steiner is deeply Christian. He has the most tremendous reverence for Christ and Christ's death on Calvary, on Golgotha. He calls this the mystery of Golgotha, and he speaks about this being the entire turning point in the life of the cosmos. Steiner is not a New Ager. You know, if you want, you can say he's some kind of Christian heretic, and certainly there are, resemblances between anthroposophy and Nestorianism and things like that. I'm not going to argue with you, but what you can't say is that Steiner is some kind of progressive New Ager, with no reference to Christ, no understanding of Christ. No, Steiner is very different from the New Age, and Steiner really deserves credit in helping to save me from the whole kind of Findhorn, New Age, progressive kind of worldview that I was in. Another thing we've talked about, Steiner is so deeply aware of evil and of sin in ways that New Agers are usually not aware of and will actually often try to deny. So that's part of why I want to honor Steiner's essential Christianity. And I still find it very difficult to do justice to Steiner in these episodes. Great difficulty indeed. I constantly fear that I am doing him injustice. So many paradoxes here. Further complicated by the fact that I have two kinds of people watching these videos now. There will be Catholics watching me saying, "What do you mean you've been too harsh to Steiner?" There will be people who are very sympathetic, very understandably sympathetic to Steiner, who feel that I'm not giving the man the credit he deserves. Let me say something to this. If you're a Catholic, you will see that Rudolf Steiner was hostile to the greatest hope you have in this world. As a Catholic, I need to face that Rudolf Steiner was hostile to the greatest hope I have in this world. Even if the church is in this terrible state, my faith lies in the church regenerated, as Tomberg is pointing to. My faith is in the regenerated church healing us through the sacraments. That is where my faith is, and Steiner served to point tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people away from the church. His influence may be even greater than anthroposophy, just pointing people away from the church, because he believed that in this modern era, the church, the Catholic Church, was a backwards, retrograde movement, that movements like Jesuitism were trying to hang on to the past in a way that was actually destructive or even dangerous for humanity. I hardly know how to handle these things. Knowing Steiner, I know the nobility of his heart, the greatness of his heart. I see that. But this movement to cut us off from the church and tradition, Tomberg warns of surgery. Tomberg is not trying to cut us off from our past or from tradition. Now I'm aware, of course, that in some ways Steiner does hark back to the past, and it's very important to him. But in all kinds of ways, he is attempting to cut us off from the threads of the past, the threads of the church. He is attempting to say that things like Jesuitism are dangerous throwbacks. He is attempting to sever us, to cut us off from a past that he no longer believes is relevant for the future, or relevant for the evolution of consciousness. He is attempting to assert an esoteric Christianity that is, if you like, surgically detached from the church. And all of this Tomberg comes to deeply, deeply reject. Tomberg warns about trying to surgically divide Christianity into so-called esoteric and exoteric segments. Tomberg is saying, no, Steiner, you can't do this. There is a staggering rejection of many aspects of anthroposophy in Tomberg's work, and yet I do sometimes fear that I'm not honouring Rudolf Steiner sufficiently on these videos. But just to come to this point that I'm making, Tomberg here is saying what will save the life of the soul of humanity, what will cultivate and stimulate the soul of humanity, are things like devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and fidelity to the Church. Rudolf Steiner is not saying those things at all. All right, ladies and gentlemen. It's now some months later. Indeed, this episode is like no other. Some of you might have noticed that at the very start of this episode, which was filmed in January, just after Christmastide, I said 2022. This is now July 2023. So we've been making this episode for 18 months now. Indeed, you could say it's an episode 15 years in the making. I'm quite conscious that it has a somewhat erratic quality as a result, but these episodes take me time. But a lot has happened during these 18 months that I've been making this episode. Some of it very relevant to the themes here. And before we come back to the themes here, I have an announcement to make, and I have a personal tribute to make that is entirely relevant, because in the last months we have lost a very great man, a man very close to Tomberg, not well known in the Anglosphere, but a great man who helped me greatly, and I need to pay tribute to him. But before we do that, I just want to make an announcement. The announcement is this. Many of you will know, I hope, that in addition to this YouTube channel, my wife Kim and I also have a website called JesusSacratissimum.org. So same name as my big book. But alas, that website hasn't been functioning very well for many years, which really kind of discouraged me putting effort into it. But all is now changed. The website has gone through a massive revamp, relaunch. I almost want to say it's been resurrected from the dead. What happened there is that I just didn't have the resources to sort of fix the website, and it badly needed fixing, but somebody with the necessary design and technical skills very, very graciously, free of charge, offered me a way to really redo the whole website these last months. And for that reason, that's partly why some of the more recent drops in this video, I just had to drop all the videos, drop everything to focus on the website. So we still have 2 or 3 videos in the pipeline that never got finished, just like this one never got finished. Hopefully those will be coming out soon now that the new website is up. So there's a link down below to the new website, called JesusSacratissimum.org. But why this is relevant to this episode is that over the years on this website, I have done many articles about Valentin Tomberg, also about the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the life of the heart. And if this episode, due to the erratic way that it's been being made over the last year and a half, is unclear in any way, you can go to the website and you will find a lot more there. There's a whole archive of posts devoted to Tomberg, devoted to the Sacred Heart, devoted to many other things, and that should clarify things. So yeah, I'll just show you the website briefly. Here it is, bring it up on the screen. And I'll also say to you that if you look at the website, you'll see that there's a lot of these buttons for buy me a coffee. We are making an appeal now. To be really, really frank with you, we are struggling to make ends meet a little bit, as all kinds of people these days with the cost of living crisis are struggling to make ends meet. And if you're struggling to make ends meet, I'm not going to ask you to buy us a coffee. But if you're not struggling to make ends meet, and you do see value in what Kim and I have been doing on this website over all these years, what we've been doing on the channel, if you see value in that, you will find that these yellow buttons take you to a page where you can buy us a coffee. And we would be very, very grateful if you would consider that. Thank you. All right. I now want to pay this personal tribute to a man that I have called with total sincerity great. And the man I have in mind is Dr. Michael Frensch. He was a German philosopher, a very fine philosophical mind, although I'm not really qualified to speak about that aspect of his work. More relevant to this, far more relevant, is that he was Valentin Tomberg's biographer. He co-wrote the German biography. He also, 40 years ago, translated Meditations on the Tarot from French into German. I considered him, until his rather unexpected sudden death recently, the world's leading authority on Valentin Tomberg. And as I mentioned before, I spoke about this in my huge episode where I spoke about my 25-year journey with Tomberg. I spoke about how I lived in Germany for a couple of years and really had the deep privilege of knowing Michael. And there's so much here, ladies and gentlemen. His sudden and unexpected passing has hit Kim and myself quite deeply. I've really spent time going through his writings, those that I could. I've, been able to have some of them in English, others, I can still stumble through German, really thinking about all that he did, all that he was. I mean, really what I want to say right up here, all that he was. As Kim and I have been in this process of thinking about Michael, praying for him, our hearts and our prayers really go out to Michael's family in Germany and all of those who knew and loved him. But as I've been, in my own personal process, going through his work, remembering him, remembering what he gave me all those years ago in Germany, I really need to say this quite sincerely. I believe he was one of the finest people I have ever met in my life. I say that with no sentimentality or exaggeration. I see that Michael was dedicated to the world in a way that very, very few other people are. Those of you who know Meditations on the Tarot may recall the section in the 19th letter where Tomberg is speaking about the star that led the mages from the Orient to the Christ child, back in the Gospel story, where he speaks about how these mages did not consult Herod and his people. They followed the star with courage. And Tomberg develops this as a call to follow the star without consulting Herod and his people, without falling into the grip of the currents of this world, materialism, quantitative materialism, We're going into this in a pretty big piece that I'm writing for the website, so that's just a foreshadowing. But what I can say now is that I see that Michael followed his star. I feel like I have met very few other people who were so dedicated to the star, so dedicated to thinking and working for this world that, as we've been speaking about in this episode, in reference to Tomberg, is deluged with materialism. Michael was thinking very much about the very issues that we're speaking about. He was working with these issues. He was a man who was very with, what I've been raising here, the continuity between, Rudolf Steiner's thinking and the later Valentin Tomberg, the later Catholic Valentin Tomberg, but unusually, he was also very conscious of the discontinuities. When I knew him all those years ago in Germany, I mentioned this in the big Tomberg episode, the 5-hour episode on my journey with Tomberg. Michael, I'm a convert to Catholicism. Michael, because of Tomberg, Michael was baptized a Catholic, but left the church, but reverted to the faith very much because of Tomberg. He was actually helping me enter the Catholic Church 25 years ago, something like that, not quite 25 years ago. I mentioned how we didn't have a car. He was driving us to Mass. He was a very different Catholic to myself, but he was, going to Mass, praying his rosary, and really absorbing that Tomberg changed. Tomberg changed. And I have to say that this is one of my great concerns in many people working with Tomberg's legacy, that they're not aware of the radical difference between the Anthroposophical Tomberg and the Catholic Tomberg. Michael was aware of that difference because he really dwelt and worked and pondered Tomberg. But I don't want to get into those issues right now. I want to say that Kim and I owe him so much at a personal level. I don't know how to even describe this to you. I'm going to say just a little bit about how he helped us. And then I'm going to come back more to what I think he has to offer the world. But in terms of how he helped us, we moved to Germany to be, in part, there were a number of different reasons, but in part, close to the work he was doing there. I even briefly worked with him, although the truth to tell, it's a bit ridiculous because he was helping me far, far, far more than I ever helped him. And he helped me in various ways. Some very generous, but we won't go into all the personal details here. He helped me, when I arrived in Germany, I was still, to a large extent, caught up in the whole Alice Bailey, Findhorn, Blavatsky kind of worldview. Michael certainly helped me break free from that. It was the first time that I had really stepped out of the Anglo-American world, first time I'd ever done that, and Michael helped reorient me to a very different way of looking at things, a way of looking at things that wasn't always American. But his profound Christian witness touched me. He was a man of the heart. We've been speaking in this episode about the life of the heart. I've been speaking about how Tomberg was a profoundly human man, concerned with cultivating the life of the heart. Michael French was also concerned with cultivating the life of the heart, but he wasn't just talking his talk, he was walking it. I really don't know how to tell you how much I owe to him. That said, because some of you might be concluding, well, all the kinds of things that Roger is saying about Catholicism and Tomberg, really, they go back to Germany and Michael French. That's true and it's not true. Michael, I think, followed his star. I aspire to follow the star, and it's led us in very different directions. I do have certain disagreements with Michael, or I had certain disagreements with him. But you know what? You can have disagreements with someone, and you can respect them and cherish them very, very deeply. In essence, Michael was a very different kind of Catholic than, I think many of my viewers here on this channel are. Maybe he wouldn't have fully understood, what Kim and I are trying to do on this channel, although he was supportive of me in numerous, kind ways over the years. But we had something very different. He was very much working with the essence of Rudolf Steiner. He was critical of anthroposophy, but he was working with the essence of Rudolf Steiner, just the way that Tomberg was. His focus was not so much the church, as the church has become Kim's and my focus, so there was a difference there. But he was a deeply, deeply and profoundly Christian man of the heart, very, very much working through the very issues that we've been speaking about in this episode, about the deluge of materialism. Really, what I've been speaking about, the Borgification of the world, or humanity threatening to become more and more like the Centaur. Because those kind of threads, as I say, they're in Tomberg, they're certainly in Rudolf Steiner, and I owe so much to Michael to helping wake me up to these things. Because the sort of New Age guy I was, who arrived in Germany, still sort of filled with Findhorn and all kinds of things in my mind, a dawning age of Aquarius, Michael really woke me up. I can't take this whole episode over speaking about Michael. Maybe I will do a fuller tribute to him on the new website, or maybe we'll be saying more in a future episode. But I want to say that the world has lost a great man, and really nobody writing about Tomberg has convinced me that he understood Tomberg in the way that Michael understood Tomberg. So yes, my prayers go out to his family and to all those who knew and loved him. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to keep going with this erratic, chaotic splurge of an episode. I'm aware that a lot of the traditional Catholics who support and appreciate my work may be really puzzled or even troubled by some of the things I'm saying here. How I speak about the essence of Steiner as opposed to the system of anthroposophy that he created. They may still be scratching their heads. I won't be surprised if I lose some subscribers here or support with this splurge of an episode. I want to try and clarify some things about who Steiner was and why he was the way he was. Because it is true that Steiner made all kinds of critical comments about the Jesuits, about the Catholic Church. Does that mean that he was just into Catholic bashing? No, I don't think so, actually. And I want to explain that. What I think sets Steiner apart from a lot of the kind of Catholic bashing that we have in this world is that Steiner, all kinds of paradoxes here, but did express some kind of support for Catholicism right up through the end of the medieval era. And then he comes to an idea that is obviously completely contradictory to the church, and I think a very tragic idea, that we no longer need the church because humanity is moving on, and also that humanity is in the gravest danger. This danger of what we're calling, I'm calling the Borgification of the world. Steiner believes that we are moving into incredible danger, and that the church will no longer be able to help us. He believes this in the sincerity of his heart, rather than really, I think, wanting to bash the church. Now, it's unfortunately true that all kinds of people that read Steiner and read some of his polemic against the church are your sort of more ordinary Catholic bashers. That's unfortunately true. But if you go into Steiner, there is an essence there that I think can be retrieved. And I just want to read you, ladies and gentlemen, a single sentence from Steiner that is relevant to everything we're saying on this episode, but it's really quite paradigmatic for Steiner, to be honest. It's like Steiner has 350 books. There's no way you can sum up all of Steiner's thinking in a single sentence. But if I had to choose a single sentence, to be honest with you, this one wouldn't be too bad. So I'll read it to you. Steiner said in 1912, "Without new spiritual impulses, technology will not only dominate outer life, but will overpower and numb us, driving out all religious, philosophical, artistic, and even ethical interests in the higher sense. Men would turn into something like living automata." That's what we're talking about in this episode, ladies and gentlemen. The threat of humanity becoming so technologized. That's not a word, but you know what I mean. It's not a verb. So under the power of technology, so under the power of technocracy, that its humanity is destroyed. And this is Steiner in 1912. Steiner, I think with great foresight, was seeing that this world that we're experiencing now was coming into being. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I said so much has changed in the last 15 years, and I was merely speaking about, the most obvious things, like the smartphones and the Facebook and, social media and all those things that, didn't exist, or barely existed 15 years ago when I recorded that video. But, ladies and gentlemen, obviously, so much has changed just in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, we've had this unprecedented situation where the world elites could act in unison to do something like place the world population or much of the world population in something like de facto house arrest, based on a virus that may have been created in a laboratory. I mean, that was once, at the beginning of the crisis, clearly seen as conspiracy theory by the mainstream. But even in the mainstream, you will see more and more people saying this is plausible and entirely possible. Obviously, I'm no expert in virology or epidemiology. I'm in no position to say, but clearly, even if this virus was a natural phenomenon, the very fact that it could have been created, the very fact that we can do these things in laboratories now, points to very, very scary possibilities in the future. And, we live, as I've been saying on this channel, there's obviously all kinds of us are saying, in a world of increased surveillance, increased propaganda, just bombarding us 24/7. We are living in extraordinary times. Extraordinary times. And, I said something about fearing that I would lose support, by making this video. I think that's probably true. But I need I need to follow where the star leads me. And the star leads me, although I'm very, very different from Michael French in certain ways, the star leads me to saying that there is something of truth in this essence of Steiner, if not the system of anthroposophy that he created, of so-called esoteric Christianity detached from the church. Forgive me if I'm going to be pedantic here, ladies and gentlemen, but I just want to read you this sentence again, because it's a sentence worthwhile contemplating, in my view. 1912. Without new spiritual impulses. We'll come to that in a moment, what he means by new spiritual impulses. But without new spiritual impulses, technology will not only dominate outer life, but will overpower and numb us, driving out all religious, philosophical, artistic, and even ethical interests in the higher sense. Men, he's saying, would be turned into something like living automata. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about in this whole episode. And, ladies and gentlemen, I want to come back to the theme of evil, because Steiner saw evil at work in our growing powers of technology. And, if we're Catholics of faith, and that's a term I use to distinguish between Catholics who are maybe overly hypnotized by Enlightenment rationalism and don't really look to a world of the miraculous, look to a world of the supernatural, maybe pay lip service to the idea of demons, but don't really see that we are, Tomberg writes about this as well, obviously all kinds of people do, we are in a world surrounded by invisible entities, whether they are angels or archangels, or whether, yes, they are legions of demons trying to tempt us. Why? If you believe in demons trying to tempt us, why would you not think that they would be interested in the growing powers of technology? Now, Steiner, we brought this up earlier, I'm going to go into a little bit now, spoke about this great demonic presence Ahriman with legions of Ahrimanic demons. Steiner insisted that we needed to start thinking about Ahriman and not simply Lucifer, that we needed to see evil as a binary. I rather think now, I was wondering if we were going to go into this in depth, but I'm rather thinking now that I want to save this to go into in more depth in a future episode. But briefly now, the crucial point is that in Steiner's repeated assertions of what we need to do for the future, he was absolutely insistent on this binary of Lucifer and Ahriman. He saw all kinds of manifestations of it. So, for example, he saw the Ahrimanic working more in the West and particularly in America. He saw the Luciferic, as he spoke about it, working more in the East, including Eastern Europe, Russia, India. We're going to save that for another time. But my point now is that, yes, there is this kind of anthroposophical orthodoxy that insists we need to think of evil in this light. And Valentin Tomberg comes to clearly reject this. There's a whole passage in the 15th letter of Meditations on the Tarot, and if you know the book, you think that nothing is wasted in this book. He goes into this for a whole page, critiquing the anthroposophical idea of Lucifer and Ahriman, saying that it's, again, deprived us of life. If you know the Tomberg's correspondence in his German biography, written, as I say, co-written by Michael French, you will see that he goes further in his critique of Steiner's idea of Ahriman. he actually says that Ahriman leads the Anthroposophists to grandiosity and inflation, which is another aspect that you find throughout Meditations on the Tarot in a more implicit way. In a more implicit way, in Meditations on the Tarot, he is continually suggesting that Hermeticists, and he is including the Anthroposophists here, so he's including the French Hermeticists, but he means, the German stream as well, which includes people like Steiner, are subject to tremendous psychological inflation and grandiosity. And in his private correspondence, he is really suggesting that this kind of idea that Steiner has about Lucifer and Ahriman is creating that. This is really important stuff to look at in terms of Tomberg's relationship with anthroposophy. It represents another serious rupture from anthroposophy that many people are not acknowledging. I mean, this is one of my concerns here, ladies and gentlemen, as I've been saying in these episodes and on the website, that people are too easily conflating the pre-Catholic Tomberg with the post-Catholic Tomberg, and I think I'm going to come back to this, but it's creating serious problems in my view. But right now, let's stick with the main theme, that Steiner was warning that technology could drive out everything that is human about us, the religious, the artistic, the moral. Technology could reduce us to automatons, and Steiner saw evil at work there, and none of that, in my view, is foreign to the Catholic faith. Again, you don't have to believe in a binary evil of Lucifer and Ahriman, but if you're a Catholic of faith who takes the supernatural world seriously, and you're not disbelieving in either the miraculous or the demonic, why shouldn't you think that demons would be at work in technology, in and through technology? Or why shouldn't you think that demons would like to strip us of our humanity and reduce us to automatons? Now, a key thing here to come back to is that Steiner is saying we need new spiritual impulses. What does he mean by that? Well, I started going into that in the big episode I first did on Steiner and Tomberg. But basically, Steiner, I've got to put this very, very simply now. Steiner was suggesting that there were new ways, different ways of seeing the world. Ways of seeing the world that would open up through profound levels of meditation and contemplation. He was on this track, that this was the answer to the coming technocracy. I'm going to throw out an aside here. I didn't even know I was going to say this, but another great writer who I also disagree with is Michael Martin, who is working with Steiner and Tomberg's legacy. Michael is very much speaking about the growing technocracy. That's really just a footnote, although there's going to be more on the website, more coming up on the website about this, I believe. But my point, I'll say again, you can respect people even if you disagree with them, even very deeply. My point here is that there are a set of people, going back to Steiner in 1912, really seeing how technology and technocracy has the power, materialism has the power to overwhelm the human soul, the human spirit, reduce us to thinking beasts. And I'm looking out at the world now, and I'm saying there's definitely something in this. And, while many aspects of Steiner's thinking are unbelievably problematic for the church, and are utterly unacceptable to me as a Catholic, this core insight that technology and technocracy is far more dangerous than many of us realize, was really very prophetic in 1912. So I'm with that, but I should say, what does Steiner mean by new spiritual impulses? So again, deepened levels of contemplation and meditation.
I find it useful to contemplate the difference between those two forms of cognition. An awareness where the head can say, well, of course, there's all kinds of suffering in this world. And then a form of contemplation where it's no longer a head process.
You know, I've been speaking in this episode about what Tomberg has to say about the power of silence. I've been speaking of what I came to in the profound silence that Paray-le-Monial opened me up to.
And it feels as though through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, I'm being given the grace of feeling the horror more and more deeply. In these holy nights, this is January the 4th, 2008, I've had the privilege of spending many of these holy nights since Christmas in Paray-le-Monial in France, the city of the Sacred Heart of Christ, and feeling that presence more and more deeply.
So much so that it transformed my life. You know, I've said in the other episodes about Paray that it was finally only in Paray, through the silence there, that I could come to stop resisting the Catholic Church and really become Catholic. But look, I'm digressing again. I think the difference is that between Tomberg and Steiner here, is that they're both seeing something is needed. Something is needed to overcome the Centaur, to overcome the Borgification of the world. But Tomberg is going to places that Steiner would never have done. As I said, Steiner would have completely rejected devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, because he sees the Jesuits as trying to hold us back in evolution, the evolution of consciousness, that these ideas for him were appropriate for the medieval era, but they're not appropriate for where we're headed now. And Steiner does get into, like, polemical battle against Catholics, against the Jesuits, also against the Theosophists, you know, the people into Blavatsky, you know, who are at the root of the New Age movement. You know, as I say, a lot of Michael Frensch's understanding of Steiner helped liberate me from Theosophy, because Theosophy really is, as I've argued elsewhere, at the root of today's New Age movement, and so much of, you know, what's often called today modern spirituality or alternative spirituality, you scratch the surface of it, and you really see that it goes back to the so-called universal spirituality that Madame Blavatsky was trying to promote. Oh my, just so many issues here. My experience of living outside of the Anglo-American world, living in Germany, living in Switzerland, living in France, living in Spain, I do see that the Anglo-American world, which is where Theosophy has been most triumphant, we have this kind of so-called modern spirituality, alternative spirituality, and so many people do not see its immense debt to the Eastern spirituality of Blavatsky. But Steiner saw this coming as well. Steiner saw this coming, and Steiner said to the Theosophists, no. You know, Christ crucified on Golgotha changed everything. You know, the whole Theosophical notion of trying to represent Christ as the Maitreya Bodhisattva It's a disaster. It's a disaster. And this impregnates today's New Age culture. So Steiner was trying to point to Christ crucified on Golgotha, and he came to the tragic idea that the church wasn't needed anymore, that things like devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, or what the Jesuits were promoting, was actually dangerous for humanity. But Tomberg sees things differently. He sees the glory and the miracle of the church, of the Catholic Church. And he's led me to see the glory and the miracle of the Catholic Church. He's opened that up for me. Alright, I think it's important to say that even though Tomberg is pointing to the glory and the miracle of the church, he is speaking about new spiritual impulses in a sense that shows a certain continuity with Steiner. And we need to sort of clarify this a bit. I've said, that Steiner is arguing for deepened forms of contemplation, meditation, new ways of seeing the world. That's true as far as it goes. It's, for the sake of simplicity, that may have to do for now, but it's hardly adequate. Maybe I could say that Steiner was seeing that Enlightenment rationalism had really made us tunnel visioned. We are looking at the world in an incredibly rationalistic way, a materialistic way, and that we needed to develop counterforces to break free from the Enlightenment rationalism that led to materialism. But I'm very aware that traditional Catholics listening to this will say, why do we need anything new? We have the Mass. We have the most precious thing of all. We have the Church. Here is what I would say if you're thinking that, friends. Tomberg, as far as I can see reading him, is in complete agreement with you that the Mass, the Church, is the most precious thing of all. He's actually saying to people like Steiner, and we've gone into this in previous episodes, that we only survive in this world through the Church. So yes, we only survive through the Church, through the radiation of the Church. Even if we're not participating in her sacraments, the Church is radiating out to the world. We'll be coming more to that later on in this episode, I believe. But right now, I'll just say this about Tomberg. Tomberg, who is usually so gentle and mild in his language, uses a pretty heavy word in terms of people who cannot see this. And he is speaking to his fellow Hermeticists, esotericists, when he says this. He says, if you can't see this, you're a parasite. You're living and feeding off the energy of the Church. And we, esotericists, Hermeticists, only have two options. One, to be a parasite, if we deny what the Church is giving to the world, or to be faithful friends and servants of the Church. Parasites. It's a heavy word. And I'd like now to sort of make a little parenthesis here. Because our main theme here is Tomberg's attitudes via the new spiritual impulses and the Church at the same time. But the parenthesis I want to make now is in terms of this whole situation of Tomberg saying you're a parasite if you're not a faithful and obedient servant to the Church. I am noticing now, ladies and gentlemen, a pronounced tendency in certain circles to get around this and say, well, I'm part of the Church, I belong to the Church, I'm just part of the universal Church. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you're free to say that if you want. But what I am going to object to, and this is rather complex and painful, is that you can't turn around and say that that's what Tomberg is getting at. I regret to say that there is a new biography of Tomberg out that promotes something like this idea, that Tomberg is speaking about some kind of universal church. And I'm sorry, but I can't help but be very concerned that key aspects of Tomberg's thinking are being undermined. Now, that may not be the conscious intention here. I'm sure the author genuinely believes this. But close reading of the text suggests something, Tomberg's texts suggests something very, very different to me. And I want to talk to you about what they suggest to me, ladies and gentlemen, because who I am today is someone who wrestled with these texts with Tomberg, finding them very uncomfortable. His call to obedience to the church, obedience to the hierarchy, papal infallibility, all these kinds of things. But as I wrestled with what Tomberg was really saying, which wasn't some sort of, call to some sort of ethereal, mystical, universal church separated from the institution of the Catholic Church, I saw that Tomberg was really speaking about the church. What he means by the church, let's make this clear, is the Catholic Church of the sacraments and the hierarchy and the apostolic succession, as well as the Eastern Orthodox churches that have the same sacraments, the same apostolic succession. We've touched on this before, at least, probably more than touched on it, but something that I was also very hit by, and it was not easy for me, ladies and gentlemen, but it is relevant here, is how severe Tomberg was towards Protestants. Really very severe. Really speaking about Luther and Calvin as though they had done something absolutely dreadful that needed to be atoned for by Catholics. And he goes into this in some depth in the new Tomberg Catholic book that's just been published, Personal Certainty. But before this was available, one had to sort of closely read Tomberg's text, because they're just little references here, there, and everywhere, really speaking about things like the Lutheran heresy, or things like that. But I'm going to bring up for you just one little phrase that if you're reading Tomberg very carefully and you're wrestling with him, wanting to know what he really means, rather than what I'm frightened is sometimes happening, kind of projecting modern or even New Agey or Anthroposophical ideas onto what he means, well, you may not notice things like this. So we have a section here in Covenant of the Heart, and it's just a small line. I may bring it up for you on the screen. He's speaking about things that are completely different from Protestants. He's speaking about the love of God the Father. And then he makes this little interjection. As all Christians believe, even those, the Protestants, who have separated themselves from the stream of living tradition, the Church. I had to ask, why are things in that? Is Tomberg just wanting to make a gratuitous insult towards Protestants? Is that all he's doing? When he really speaks about Lutheran heresy and he makes these severe critiques of Protestantism again and again and again. And I had to wrestle with this and come to know that the last thing that Valentin Tomberg was ever capable of was gratuitous insults. He's a man of the heart and tremendous gentleness. But, clearly, whatever that last little insertion means, Tomberg is not including Protestantism in the church. That may be very hard for some of you. It was very hard for me. But what Tomberg means by the church is something that can't be represented as just some sort of universal church that embraces everyone. He's giving it clear markers if you read the text carefully. So, for example, here in the Tarot book, he writes, the Catholic Church, being Catholic or universal, cannot consider itself as a particular church among other particular churches, nor consider its dogmas as religious opinions among other religious opinions or confessions. There are just too many statements in his writing like that to easily ignore. Now I know, this is hard for many people. It was hard for me, but I really cared about what the man thought, and I cared what is his project to save the soul of humanity from materialism, from crippling degeneration. Yes, I want to come back to this new biography of Tomberg another time, probably at the website, another episode. But I will say this. My fear is that the author of that biography hasn't wrestled with the text like this. He's clearly, his sympathies are utterly anthroposophical. I think he's a good man. I've read other of his anthroposophical books. But he's really got a very ambivalent, if you read the book carefully, and I've been reading it 2 or 3 times now, this new Tomberg biography, he's got a pretty ambivalent attitude towards Tomberg's conversion. At least as I read the text, he's really suggesting that if only Tomberg had stayed in Germany, in Mittel Europa, he might have seen that Anthroposophy had a chance, that it wasn't a dead end, as he clearly came to believe. Anthroposophy was a dead end. The author even has the word fled, that Tomberg fled Germany, implying fear as his motive for leaving the sort of the sphere of the German-speaking world. Too much to go into now. But I want to say, as part of this parentheses, I am very concerned about this biography. I'm afraid I cannot help but be so, because I think that Tomberg's legacy is very important. That's what these videos are about. And if you misrepresent him as some sort of all-embracing universalist, who isn't speaking about things like dogma and hierarchy and papal infallibility and things that are distinctly Catholic, you're doing his legacy a disservice. Now, of course, in Tomberg's great charity and way of the heart, he is seeing good everywhere. He's certainly seeing goodness in Protestantism and goodness in other religions. Certainly. But there are so many references to the church, like the one that I just read you, that make it clear that he's speaking about the hierarchical church as it exists in Catholicism and as it exists in the East, although he laments the fact that in the East they have lost papal infallibility, they've lost the Pope. But clearly, that is what Tomberg means by the church. And I would also say here is that I'm frightened of 2 easy answers here, ladies and gentlemen. Because, it's easy to say, well, I'm in alignment with the church, and I'm just in alignment with some sort of universal church, where the dogmas and the doctrines aren't defined, and there's no need for obedience, because, you have some kind of ethereal idea of the church in ways that you can define for yourself. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you're entirely free to do that if you want to do that. I can't, I'm not going to, the last thing I want to do is criticize you or condemn you if you're doing that. But where I have to draw the line, is that you are going here in a different direction from Tomberg. And I beg you, please be conscious that this is a different direction to what Tomberg is saying in his Catholic works, and that's important. That's important. Yeah. I'm struggling here, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm going to say this again. I was once with these ideas myself. It was very hard to do, to become really, truly Catholic. And only by paying attention, wrestling with the texts, and the incredible silence and presence in Paray-le-Monial, could I break free from this attitude. You know, there is this idea through anthroposophy, but also other forms of Christian esotericism, you know, that the church is just this kind of backwards thing, and the people who are saying that are most often those who have not really experienced the Catholic mystery. Oh my. I think that must be the end of my little parentheses, and we need to get back to the whole stream of Tomberg and Steiner definitely having a certain essential agreement around the idea of spiritual impulses of a new nature, of a new order, are needed to sort of combat the terrible threat of rationalism, materialism, the Enlightenment, technocracy, and the Centaur. But anyway, the point now is, what am I getting at with new spiritual impulses? And if you're troubled, ladies and gentlemen, I would point out a couple of things. St. Ignatius of Loyola created these intensive meditative experiences. And Tomberg writes about those. This is right at the cusp of the modern era, the era after the medieval era, 1500s. This is the era where Steiner is saying, no, the medieval era is finished. We need something new now. Well, St. Ignatius of Loyola, Tomberg is suggesting, does provide something new. He provides the spiritual exercises, these intense meditative exercises. But St. Ignatius of Loyola doesn't break with the past. No, St. Ignatius of Loyola is with obedience, poverty, and chastity of the traditional Catholic orders, and then he adds a fourth vow, a vow of obedience to the Pope. But he brings in something new, Tomberg says, and stresses this. And what we've been speaking about with devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, Tomberg speaks about that. We're going to come back to that passage before we finish, as rekindling the heart, cultivating the life of the soul. This impulse of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus cultivated the life of the soul, cultivated the life of the heart. And you'll recall from that passage that Tomberg is also speaking about the danger of Enlightenment rationalism unleashing materialism on the world, with the danger of this eventually leading to the Centaur. A being where the heart is dead. But you can think at least in some sort of technological way, and you can act like an animal, but you can't feel. And Tomberg is speaking about the danger being so great that heaven intervened with something new, because the medieval church did not have devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus like this. It was a new impulse in the life of the church, but it was an impulse that remained true to the church. And yeah, just for the sake of my Irish viewers, I want to say, maybe no country in the world, like Ireland, took up devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Ireland took up this devotion, born in France, maybe even more than the French did. And it had something so deeply to do with transforming Ireland. If some people will find these lines that I've ripped out of Tomberg about devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus as a special intervention from heaven, highly speculative, I'm not going to argue with them. I'm simply going to say that my experience living in Ireland, and Ireland shaped for centuries by devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, that's what informs me here. I might add to this, there is so much going on, I think, especially in America, emphasizing Celtic spirituality, Celtic Christianity. The Ireland I know, the Ireland I love, was transformed by this devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And if you take Tomberg's thinking there very seriously, and I have come to take it very seriously myself, maybe that says something about why Ireland was so different from so much of the world. Until Ireland was in recent years overwhelmed 24/7 by the kind of liberal and progressive propaganda coming out of London, New York, Hollywood. Alright, but what I really want to stay with here is this whole idea of new spiritual impulses arising in the last 500 years of modernity to countermand, to address the problems, the unique problems that modernity has thrown up with, for example, the scientific revolution and Enlightenment rationalism. That's what I want to stay with here. And just want to read you a very brief quote from Tomberg from his letter on the Pope in Meditations on the Tarot. This is page 111. Many thinkers and scientists want to think without the heart in order to be objective, which is an illusion, because one can in no way think without the heart. And he goes on to say that what one can do is to think with a humble and warm heart instead of with a pretentious and cold heart. Which is, what threatens to overwhelm us if we get too caught up in statistics, data, analyzing. Tomberg, speaks about the problem of scrutinizing the world. Something else he brings in, for example, the French philosopher Henri Bergson, and he brings in how Bergson speaks about how we think about reality. So, for example, Bergson is talking about time, and he's pointing out that you could go like 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, and that's how we have to represent time to our minds. But it's not real. Time flows. It's not an endless series of digitized events. Even if you go 1.1 second, 1.2 second, 1.3 second, 1.4 second, you're still missing the essence of what time is. So Tomberg is working with people, suggesting that the Enlightenment has captured our minds in such a way that we can't approach reality properly. Tomberg would also be working with the Russian Sophiologists, beginning with Soloviev, but Bulgakov and Florensky. And I can't speak authoritatively to the Russian Sophiologists. All I can do, as I've done in a previous episode, is point you to Michael Martin's magnificent work with Russian Sophiology. I am filled with respect for that work. I'm also filled with respect for Michael's understanding of how technology and technocracy is murdering our souls. Doesn't mean that I agree with Michael on all points. Maybe I say this. Where I do have disagreements with Michael, I still respect his heart. He has a heart in pain about the church, and I far prefer people with a heart in pain, people whose hearts are really feeling, then where, then the life of becoming again, I repeat it again and again, like the centaur, a thinking animal but without heart. Where he goes with that pain is very different from where I go, and we're not going to go more into that now. But my real point here is to talk about how Tomberg is pointing to new impulses, whether it comes through devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, or whether it comes through the Russian Sophiologists encouraging us to contemplate the world, look at the world with eyes of love. This, I understand, is at the core of Sophiology, not to coldly scrutinize the world, but to look at the world with reverence. And again, Michael Martin brings that forward in such a beautiful way. New spiritual impulses. Tomberg, we've brought this up before, but we'll also mention that, again, that the Tarot book is filled with reference to psychotherapy and depth psychology. And Tomberg is honoring the fact that Jung took Freud, which, if you know Freud, it all comes down to libido, 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 sex, 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 sex. Jung, at least, transformed psychotherapy by opening it out to the religious dimension as something far deeper than simply libido. Now, Tomberg would say he regrets the fact that, Jung could not go further towards Christianity. I believe Tomberg would basically say that Jung's thought needs to be baptized. I believe I've said on this channel before that I've had a couple of years of Jungian analysis with a Jungian, obviously, a very, very profound man. In fact, I would also say that the Jungian analyst I had, but he was a Christian. He was an Anglican minister. He was an Anglican minister, and I apologize to people that I may offend by the fact that I'm not saying he was an Anglican priest. I have followed a long journey here. It was once very, very painful for me to say that. And I don't wish to offend Anglicans. But when you look at the history of the Anglican Church, with its utter denial of transubstantiation, with the fact that, one was even compelled to take oaths against transubstantiation, I believe Tomberg would say, and not only Tomberg, but Tomberg, who so clearly defended transubstantiation, as, the primary role of the priest is the miracle of the Eucharist, the miracle of transubstantiation. We get into complicated waters here. My real point is, this Anglican minister was also a Jungian analyst. He helped me profoundly. I will also say that he was one of the finest people I've met in my life. And ladies and gentlemen, there are very few of them. I'm not talking about everyone being one of the finest people I've ever met in my life. No, we're talking about a handful of people here. I include Michael Frensch in that, and I include the Anglican minister who was baptizing Jung. Huge things here, but I'm digressing a lot. My real point is that Tomberg, as well as Steiner, were looking out at the tremendous changes that have happened since the scientific revolution, since the dawn of rationalism, since the so-called Enlightenment. And Steiner was looking for a new form of Christianity that he thought was necessary to combat all these new dangers to the soul. Tomberg, again, breaks with that. He's not interested in a new form of Christianity surgically detached from the church or the sacraments, but he is honoring new impulses, whether they come through St. Ignatius of Loyola, whether they come through devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, or yes, whether they come through the depth psychologists like C.G. Jung, and we pray and hope for Christians and Catholics, at least I pray and hope, for Christians and Catholics who will baptize the work of Jung. So yes, Tomberg favours new impulses. I want to come back to those lines that I read you from Tomberg on the Sacred Heart about cultivating the life of the soul, cultivating the life of the heart. This is needed now more than ever, and we need everything possible to cultivate the life of the soul and the life of the heart, because the life of the heart and the life of the soul, I agree with Tomberg, is in grave danger. But just because new things are needed to countermand new dangers, doesn't mean that you throw the church into the dustbin of history. Look, somewhere in, I think it's the 8th letter, Tomberg is speaking about the need for justice to the church. I know that a lot of the anger that's going on around the church that I think that some of my viewers will have, not all of my viewers, but some of them will have. Tomberg writes that if you really understand what the church is, and you use the balance of justice, this is the 8th letter, the balance of justice, you will never throw stones at the church again. And I want to say a little bit about this balance of justice. I'm not unaware of the terrible things that members of the church on earth have done. But I'm aware of something else. Ladies and gentlemen, there are something like 400,000 Catholic priests in this world, and I don't know how many Orthodox priests there are, but Catholic priests are expected to celebrate the Eucharist every day. Now, not all of them live up to that, but I think we can safely guess that, a couple 100,000 times a day, somewhere on the planet, his body and his blood are becoming manifest on the altars of the Catholic Church, also the Orthodox churches of the East. I know the Orthodox don't celebrate the sacrament as regularly as Catholics do, but this miracle is happening. What I'm doing in these videos on Tomberg is I'm testifying to the fact that I followed Tomberg into the church, and I found this miracle transforming me more than anything I ever found in Anthroposophy, more than anything I ever found in the New Age. I come to this channel, I bring all these experiences, whether it's the experience of being in Jungian analysis, or whether it's the experience of living on farms without electricity and having to get your water in a wheelbarrow up the mountain. I come to this channel as a traditional Catholic, but I know with some very unusual experiences. As I see it, providence and destiny give us these experiences, and I have to work with them. I have to do these New Age videos, I need to do the work I'm doing with Steiner and Tomberg, and we have this kind of erratic splurge of an episode that I'm a bit embarrassed about. We're still coming to the old video footage from Kim that Kim's embarrassed about, so we're all embarrassed here. I prefer my books where I can order things better, but I just need to speak, and right now I feel like I need to witness to the miracle of the Eucharist. I am feeling the horror of this increasingly technocratic world, the horror of, viruses created in laboratories, and who knows how many more are coming down the line. The horror of our technocratic elites gaining more and more power over us, the power of continual surveillance. If I go on, it could get very depressing. But I have hope, ladies and gentlemen, and my greatest hope is in what he gave us, his body and his blood, manifest on all the altars of the world at least 200,000 times a day. That is my greatest hope. And with that in mind, let's look again at what Tomberg writes in terms of the balance of justice. He counsels, make use of the balance of justice and judge impartially. When you have done so, you will no doubt say, never will I throw stones, in thought or through word or deed, against the Church, since it is she who makes possible and stimulates and protects human endeavor for the glory of God. And as Hermeticism is such an endeavor, it could not exist without the Church. We Hermeticists have only one choice, either to live as parasites, for it is thanks to the Church that we are able to live. If we are strangers to, or are hostile to, the Church, or to live as her faithful friends and servants, if we understand what we owe to her. Again, Tomberg wouldn't have to write this if this were just, some kind of New Agey church that anyone can sort of be aligned with, some kind of universal New Agey church. That would be easy. But Tomberg is saying this to Hermeticists precisely because he knows it isn't easy for many of them to love and honor the Church on earth as it exists, with all its human failures and its necessary dogma, doctrine, and hierarchy. I mean, why would anyone want to throw stones at some perfect, pristine, universal, all-embracing, mystical church? There would be no point in throwing stones at such a church, and there would be no point in Tomberg counseling people not to throw stones. It's just too easy. It's too easy to think that Tomberg means something like this. Yes, the Church is in a terrible state. Tomberg also writes about the Church regularly degenerating and then regenerating. And I agree with Tomberg that we're waiting for a regeneration of the Church. This is why I think the issues around the liturgy are so important. I mean, another factor of Tomberg that more and more people are becoming conscious of now is that even when he was an anthroposophist back in the 30s, Tomberg was really participating in the Russian Orthodox liturgy, which was very unusual for an anthroposophist. Steiner was so on the track that we didn't need this, but even as an anthroposophist, Tomberg was participating in the Russian Orthodox liturgy. And after he becomes a Catholic, he says, we need the Church. And if you don't really recognize that, you're in danger of becoming a parasite, because the Church is feeding you. It's these, 200,000 times a day, his body and blood becoming manifest in the world. Alright, before I close, I think I want to say something that Tomberg repeatedly says. He repeatedly comes back to the Church is all we need for our salvation. That is through and through Tomberg's Catholic writings. If he is pointing to these other impulses, it's about rescuing humanity, rescuing the life of the soul of humanity, not individual salvation. And speaking of the Eucharist as my greatest hope, the source of my salvation, I want to just do a small brief detour into J.R.R. Tolkien, beloved author of my youth, who spoke about the Eucharist, the Blessed Sacrament. And read you a quick quote here, and then tell you how this applies. So, Tolkien said, "Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves on earth." And then another quote from Tolkien, "The only cure for sagging or fainting faith is communion, though always itself perfect, complete, and inviolate, the Blessed Sacrament does not operate completely and once for all in any of us. Like the act of faith, it must be continuous and grow by exercise. Frequency is of the highest effect. 7 times a week is more nourishing than 7 times at intervals. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I found when I followed Tomberg into the church, into the Catholic Church, into the sacramental life. I naturally began to go to Mass more and more often until daily became what I needed. In fact, we've been speaking about the lockdown. The first lockdown that happened when I was cut off from the Mass was I could feel the absence of this. I fell into the greatest depression that I have fell into for something like 15 years. So I'm here on this channel saying that I come from this background as a esotericist and anthroposophist and New Ager, where again and again and again I was told in one way or another the church had nothing to offer. And I found the most precious thing of all, daily communion with the heart of Christ in the Eucharist. And, we emphasize the liturgy so much on this channel because, regretfully, I've often had to go to dreadful liturgies in order to go daily to the Mass. Dreadful liturgies. But it didn't matter. The liturgy is profoundly important. But in terms of what I was feeling in my heart and how it was transforming me, this daily Mass has helped me in the darkness, as Tolkien says, out of the darkness of my life. This is what he found. This is what I found in Paray-le-Monial, which is an incredibly Eucharistic city, because since the whole place was transformed by the birth of the cult of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, all kinds of orders moved there, and the Mass is celebrated like maybe nowhere else, or almost nowhere else on earth, apart from places like, the Vatican, I suppose, and Lourdes and certain other great sites of Catholicism. But, I want to give that testimony to the Eucharist, because I'm hoping, I admit it, I confess it, I'm thinking that there may be some of you who have got to the end of this, very skeptical of the Church, but maybe filled as I was filled with all this esoteric and anthroposophical and even New Agey kind of ways of thinking, and I'm going to suggest to you that maybe all of that could have blinded you, if you don't mind my saying that, to what is really going on in the sacraments. And there I include the sacrament of confession. One of the things that is so potent for me is that I frequently experience is to go to confession and Mass at the same time. And I come out of that feeling particularly cleansed. There's often a feeling the very next morning, still there, that something has happened. Something has happened in that double sacrament of confession and Eucharist. And Tomberg was pointing to all of this as primary. This, he really does say in the course of the book, he knows that this is what's essential for salvation, and the other things he's pointing to are secondary. But in this incredibly tragic situation that we find of a world falling ever more into materialism, becoming ever more mechanical, all kinds of things are needed. Whether it's the Ignatian exercises, devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, baptizing the work of C.G. Jung, because some people need psychotherapy, and a baptized psychotherapy, a Christian or Catholic psychotherapy, is what I would hope to be looking towards. This whole notion that I've said in this may make some people scratch their heads, baptizing Jungian psychotherapy, or Tomberg is speaking in the book about baptizing Hermeticism, or at least certain elements of Hermeticism. As I've said before, the book has many unusual Hermetic elements that, if baptized and rightly understood, I don't think are in any conflict with the faith. Now, it has to be said, and we've said it before on this channel, it's at the website as well, that there are a very few heterodox elements there as well. For Catholics, this is very, very problematic if you're like a Catholic or like me. The primary thing we might mention is a very curious treatment of reincarnation. But Tomberg is not trying to baptize reincarnation. He actually says it does not belong in the church and that it's a dangerous idea. But we'll leave that aside for now. There's a bit more at the website, there may be in the future. My real point is that I am deeply concerned, as I'm sure you are, ladies and gentlemen, where we are headed in this world. And although I know the sacraments are the means of our salvation, it does not mean that our Lord does not work through other things, other devotional practices, obviously the rosary, but silence, contemplation, and of course he works through great thinkers and saints. And this is my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen. After being with Tomberg's writings now for 25 years, I cannot help but feel that I am in the presence of genius and saintliness. So whatever imperfections there are in the works, because everything in this world is fallen and imperfect, here lies one of my great hopes for the world. It's not the same as the sacraments and the church, no. But great saints, thinkers, and geniuses, yes, they have their role to play. And I think that Tomberg's role especially, is in helping people like I once was, who are sort of really just have maybe years or decades of their lives where they've never heard about the sacraments, possibly see the Catholic Church in kind of like a subtly Protestant light. I never realized how incredibly different Catholicism was from Protestantism that I grew up with. I talk about that elsewhere on this channel. Unfortunately, it's got a lot to do with the fact that after Vatican II, the Catholic Church in many ways tried to make itself Protestant. And Tomberg speaks about that as well. Very unusually and severely critical of Vatican II. I think we went into that in the end of episode 29 on Pope Francis. Tomberg's views on Vatican II. But yeah, the church, the mass, the sacraments, these are primary. But in the combat against this modern world of ever-increasing technology, ever-increasing surveillance, ever-increasing propaganda, ever-increasing soullessness and sterility, aridity like the desert, we need everything we can get. And this is why I'm making these videos on Tomberg. I've actually, in many ways, not wanted to do them, for all kinds of reasons. But I am, as I've been saying, very concerned that his legacy is being misrepresented or misunderstood. It may not be consciously misrepresented, but being misunderstood by people who are not fully wrestling with the texts. And as I look out on this, ever more scary world, we need Tomberg, I believe. And this is what I can do. This is what I can do. This series of videos on Tomberg, no matter how difficult and controversial they may be for all kinds of people. I know that there are Catholics that will really find them difficult, and there are Anthroposophists, if they bother to watch this, that will really find this difficult. Controversy on all sides. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we'll start wrapping up now. But just in closing, I'm going to draw your attention back to a very few lines from this with a little bit more commentary. Tomberg is indeed about a response to the tidal wave of materialism that flooded across the world in this century. It means the 20th century, obviously. It's far worse now in the 21st century. Which he says owes, and he's right, the outpouring of intellectual enlightenment during the age of rationalism in the 18th century, which paved the way for materialism. And he speaks about devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, had the task of rekindling the heart. We have to keep our hearts alive and feeling. There is so much in this world threatening to deaden our hearts. The light, warmth, and life streaming from the heart of Jesus was to counteract the will to power and the intellect serving this will. So much of the intellectual energies that go into technology and technocracy, it's all about serving the will to power. It's not about lifting the mind or the spirit to something higher or more transcendent. It's about creating killing machines, or entertainment devices, or, making the economy more efficient, giving people economic power. It's about serving the will to power. And it needs to be countered. Because as Tomberg continues, the soul, understood as the most refined and deepest life of the heart, is by no means certain of survival. This life of the heart isn't guaranteed. All kinds of dangers threaten, and destruction is an ever-present danger. The life of the soul has to be cultivated and stimulated, as took place and is still taking place, with the help of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. What we're saying on this channel, this devotion is important. Above all, the Mass is central to kindling the life of the heart, renewing our hearts. The Church. This episode is about the life of the heart, kindling the heart. I think it was needed on this channel because Tomberg has so much beauty to impart about the life of the heart, and other episodes have focused on other things, like, yes, the fact that Tomberg was calling for some sort of Christendom. Very, very strange political ideas, at least in modern post-Enlightenment Western Europe. But, as I so often say, Meditations on the Tarot is 100 books rolled into one, and it's nothing if it's not a book about the heart and a book about love. And that is what is so supremely important in Tomberg's work. So that is what we're saying on this channel. We'll be saying more. Before I go, we're coming to Kim in just a moment. But I would like to encourage you to take a look at our website. I poured months of work into it. Many gallons of midnight oil went into this. This was necessary. This is why I dropped all the videos, just so I could work on this massive relaunch of the website. And there's a lot there that can help fill out some of the issues. So if you're interested, do take a look at the website. I will also say that yes, we are seeking patronage through the Buy Me a Coffee program, and I ask you to consider that if you are able and you believe in what we're trying to do. But now, at long last, I come to Kim. I come to Kim all those years ago, 15 years ago, and you're going to see, if you keep with us that Kim is not speaking. Kim is singing. Kim is singing to Our Lady. Now, she's, as I say, a bit embarrassed about things. She's embarrassed by musical issues, pronunciation issues. It would be very different if she did it today. But Kim is singing to Our Lady. And if any of you want to ask what the music is, the music comes out of Kim's soul. There's no composition here. She's singing. She's just singing spontaneously from her heart. And now I leave you with Kim, and thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. God be with you all.
Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus,